All right, well, hello to everyone, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak to you guys today. My main job is to provide you with information to assist platypus conservation in the Manning River catchment. And in particular, I've been asked to speak about factors affecting platypus numbers and survival, and also platypus monitoring methods. Due to limited time, I actually won't say all that much about monitoring. There'll just be a bit at the end. Also, given my lack of knowledge about how water diversions affect the Manning's flow regime, I won't directly discuss the topic of weirs and managed flow. That does not mean that they're not very important, but I just don't feel qualified to comment in any detail. Okay, the first point I'd like to make today is that platypus population size can be affected by mortality directly caused by human activities. Major issues include rubbish entanglement, the risk that platypus drown in fish nets or yabby traps, and the risks that they're accidentally hooked by anglers. Platypus are highly vulnerable to being injured by any item of rubbish that can encircle their neck or body. The platypus's front feet end in a wide band of webbing that is great for paddling, but totally unsuited to grasping or gripping. What this means is that any entangling loops or rings that work their way along an animal's body keep moving back until they're too tight to move back any further, and then gradually start wearing through the skin and muscle. An extraordinarily wide range of items have been recovered from platypus, including tamper-proof seals from bottles and jars, a rubber home bottling ring, cable ties, a narrow offcut of PVC pipe, children's bracelets, a hospital ID wristband, and many other sorts of materials. The deep laceration in the top left photo was caused by the gasket that's shown at right. The injury is presumed to have developed gradually over many weeks. Two of the biggest rubbish-related issues for platypus in country areas are fishing line and elastic hair ties. And there's some fishing line and elastic hair ties that we picked up in just 500 meters walking along a creek near Melbourne. The problem with hair ties is that they're often lost in or near the water when girls or women go swimming. And the elastic in hair ties is also surprisingly tough, often causing platypus to suffer serious injuries or death. Although platypus are aquatic animals, they're actually not very good at holding their breath, generally drowning in under 3 minutes. They are therefore highly vulnerable to being killed in submerged fish nets or yabby traps. Although New South Wales has recently banned all use of opera house traps, there's little doubt that some degree of usage will continue, with the same being true for other banned fishing gear. The main point I'd like you to remember is that many platypus can be killed by even occasional use. And for example, there are no fewer than 8 platypus were killed in this pair of gill nets that were set in just one night in a lake in Victoria. In this photo, you can see 7 platypus that died over the course of, it's thought, about a week in the enclosed cray trap that was set in the Werribee River near Melbourne. And up to 5 platypus have been found dead in a single opera house trap. And for those of you who haven't seen an opera house trap, I've included a photo of one in the upper left-hand photo with one dead platypus in it. I've already mentioned that discarded fishing line can be very hazardous to a platypus, as you can see in the photo here to right. In addition, platypus sometimes are accidentally snagged by a fishing hook as an angler is reeling in his or her line. As in the case of litter, a platypus doesn't have any special knack for getting a hook out. This obviously is going to be a huge problem for the animal, particularly if the hook ends up in its bill. Line trailing behind a hook can also get tangled around submerged branches, causing a platypus to either drown if they can't get back to the surface or eventually die of exhaustion. The key message that needs to get out to anglers is simply to avoid fishing in the immediate vicinity of a platypus. If an animal starts feeding near a fishing line, the person should either move farther away or stop fishing until the animal itself moves on. Although mortality due to litter, nets, and fishing hooks can certainly reduce the number of platypus found in an area, in most places, the key factor limiting platypus population size will be food, mainly in the form of aquatic insects, and particularly those that live on the very bottom of a channel. Following on from this, researchers have identified a number of habitat factors that reliably contribute to platypus foraging success. The first and arguably most important factor is the occurrence of substantial and reliable surface water, particularly in the form of pools or backwaters. Although a platypus can feed successfully in places where flow is rapid, the animals generally seem to prefer to forage at sites where the water surface is calm. This is thought to at least partly reflect the fact that bugs are easier to detect and grab when water is still, as opposed to when it's rushing along. During an extended drought, platypus can survive for a time in isolated refuge pools, but these obviously provide at most limited food. A platypus that is forced to travel across land between pools in order to find enough to eat is also highly vulnerable to being preyed on by foxes or birds of prey. A second very important habitat factor for the platypus is the occurrence of plenty of vegetation growing on the banks, especially shrubs and trees overhanging the water. It's been well established through research that vegetation cover has a strong positive effect on where a platypus feeds and where it puts its burrows. Trees and shrubs shade the water in summer, helping to keep it cool so plenty of dissolved oxygen is available to the little creatures that a platypus eats. Along with lower growing plants, they also provide protective cover over platypus burrow entrances and control bank erosion that otherwise damages platypus habitat by filling the channel with sediment. Bank vegetation is also an important source of submerged woody debris and other organic matter such as dead leaves. These materials provide food for aquatic bugs to eat and also physical habitat where bugs can congregate, hide from strong currents, breed, and lay eggs. So much so that it's quite appropriate to think of aquatic woody debris as being fridges in the platypus's kitchen. Studies conducted in both Victoria and the Lower Hastings River in New South Wales have shown that platypus prefer feeding at sites dominated by relatively large mineral substrates, such as pebbles and rocks. Again, it's believed that this reflects the fact that unconsolidated fine sediment, such as sand, generally supports low numbers of macroinvertebrates for the platypus to eat. Sediment also negatively impacts platypus by filling pools. In turn, this reduces both the extent of prime feeding habitat and the availability of refuge pools during drought. Lastly, research conducted near Melbourne has shown that platypus numbers are sensitive to water quality. In particular, there's a strong negative relationship between platypus numbers and dissolved nutrients, especially phosphorus. This presumably reflects the fact that an oversupply of nutrients normally results in changes that are undesirable from a platypus's point of view, including rampant algal growth and reduced availability of preferred food types. Okay, so just to summarize, following on from what I've said so far, 3 types of action are predicted to be particularly beneficial to conserving platypus wherever they occur, in the Manning or elsewhere. Firstly, community education to reduce impacts of litter, illegal netting, and inappropriate fishing practices. Secondly, protecting and restoring native vegetation on stream and riverbanks, both to support productive aquatic bug populations and to reduce erosion. And lastly, controlling inputs of excess nutrients, including those that may originate from water treatment plants, as well as from livestock and artificial fertilizers. But I hear you asking, what about the effects on platypus of major disturbance events such as drought, fires, and floods? Okay, Gilad will obviously be addressing this question shortly in the context of his own work, but I thought you might also be interested in some of the insights gained in Victoria in and after the very severe Millennium Drought. As you can see in this graph at the top of the slide here, annual rainfall at Melbourne Airport exceeded the long-term median value in only one of 13 consecutive years from 1997 to 2009, with these 4 exceptionally dry years from 2006 to 2009 being particularly challenging to the platypus. Furthermore, there was widespread flooding across Victoria in 2005, 2010, and 2011. So the 3 years where there was more than median rainfall all involved flooding. So that in turn we know from live trapping work that reduced platypus breeding success in all of these wetter years. So as far as the Millennium Drought and its aftermath is concerned, we're actually talking about 15 very suboptimal years for platypus survival and recruitment from 1997 through 2011, followed by 9 years for potential population recovery. And since the Millennium Drought, 3 of the years have again been very dry. Unsurprisingly, most Victorian platypus populations appear to have responded to these events by contracting in size during the drought and possibly immediately thereafter in response to the flooding. The good news is that nearly all have since shown signs of recovery. For example, This graph shows the number of, how the number of unsolicited platypus sightings report received by the Conservancy from waterways located in country Victoria has varied in 5-year blocks from 2001 to 2020. As you can see, the number of platypus sightings dropped very markedly in this very dry sequence of years towards the end of the drought, and remained low in the years immediately thereafter, here, immediately following those very substantial flood years. However, sighting report began increasing in many areas starting in about 2014 and are generally now pretty much back to where they began 20 years ago. Now, I don't know if you're aware, but platypus population data have been routinely collected in the Manning River by Dr. Keith Bishop since 2007 as a byproduct of nocturnal spotlighting surveys he's been carrying out mainly to monitor fish. His study area extends from the tidal limit upstream to Cundall Flat, with surveys scheduled 3 times a year. These findings are available online, so I won't spend a great deal of time discussing them today. The main thing to note is that the orange and yellow bars here in the lower graph indicate the periods of low to very low flow as registered at the Kilawara gauging station. And the black line in the upper graph summarizes the average number of platypus recorded through time. As you can see, there's been a mainly downward trend in sightings evident since about 2014, which was, I understand, the start of the dry period that has extended through 2019 into 2020. And it looks as if, although there's a lot of variability in Keith's data, it looks as if there was an ongoing general decline through that time, but there is some indication that maybe numbers have been sightings are starting to recover now. One question that has come up repeatedly since the summer of 2019-20 is the effect that bushfires have on platypus populations. In Victoria, relevant studies have been conducted based on eDNA and live trapping. In this table, I've only summarized live trapping results, in part because it's known that tree defoliation caused by fire typically causes water temperature and microbial decomposition rates to rise in streams in the period after the fires go through. This in turn is predicted to reduce eDNA persistence and hence its post-fire detection. So one would expect that after a fire, eDNA, the number of eDNA positive findings would tend to go down. Since 2006, there have been at least 8 live trapping studies in Victoria that have been carried out in badly burnt platypus habitats, with 5 of these areas also subject to high flow events that mobilized ash and sediment. For the purpose of our discussion today, the main point of interest is that juveniles, and you can see there have been these 8 different live trapping studies carried out between 2006 and 2021. 5 have had high post-fire flows. And in terms of breeding success in this final column, you can see 4 of those 5 populations had juveniles produced in the first breeding season after disturbance. In turn, this implies that any losses that may have been sustained are likely to be offset quite quickly through recruitment. And it's interesting that the only population, this is the Elberfelde River and Donnelly Creek, where no reproduction was subsequently observed in the first year, with no juveniles and all captured, was by far the most damaged waterway with respect to post-flood sedimentation. And it was just, it was in very steep terrain, had massive amounts of sediment in terms of gravel, not just ash, but gravel and that sort of thing entering the channel. And it really, afterwards, it looked like an underwater car park. All the riffles were just smothered and all the pools were completely filled in. There was only the very beginning of pools starting to reform when we did our work, mainly just downstream of large logs. So it had been very badly degraded from the viewpoint of platypus habitat. To conclude, I'd like to return very briefly to the topic of monitoring. Although some information on the platypus's distribution in the Manning catchment is now available from sightings records, Keith's spotlighting surveys, and Gillard's live trapping surveys, it clearly would be useful to have a clearer picture of the species status, in part to establish a sound basis for future monitoring. All of the various available monitoring methods have their pros and cons, and my own advice would be to embrace diversity in monitoring approaches, insofar as this allows trends to be independently cross-checked and confirmed. In addition, it's worth noting that the eDNA method space is continuing to evolve quite rapidly, with a faster and cheaper platypus assay now in development at La Trobe Uni that hopefully will be available for field use within the next 12 months. In terms of other priorities, the single biggest challenge in conserving platypus in coming decades is likely to be climate change. I therefore recommend that resources be directed, if possible, into assessing two factors that will be critical to how well platypus can survive drought in the future, namely the availability of substantial refuge pools and the impact of human use on water resources on surface flow. Thank you very much.
All good. All right. So thanks so much. Briefly to discuss our surveys and research that we've done in the kind of the Manning and Hastings River area, which we came about really was kind of almost incidental, I would say, following the 2019 kind of 2020 bushfires across much of Eastern Australia. We were really curious to see if the potential impact of how the fires, and particularly also that followed the severe drought, impacted platypuses. Melody's done and Caesar have done quite a fair bit of work down in Victoria looking at platypuses populations after fires, and there the findings have been kind of quite probably Melody, you can probably comment on that, but it seems like that generally fire did not have significant impacts on platypuses, but we were kind of really curious to see what was kind of the synergistic or combined impacts of droughts and fires. And so we wanted to go out and survey areas that have been impacted by the fires. And our initial line of thought was to go and survey areas where there was really good baseline data for platypuses, so we can kind of compare the pre and post fire estimates, abundance estimates of platypuses. But something that is quite something that does plague the platypus in terms of assessing conservation status and monitoring is that there's very little information. There's no national or state monitoring programs for platypuses, and really the only information that is derived from like robust systematic surveys is undertaken by researchers or organizations such as the Australian Platypus Conservancy. And so there's very little information. And so in a sense, we couldn't find an area which was impacted by the fires and had good pre-fire data. So we focused on the kind of the Manning River region for two reasons. We had quite a good relationship, established relationship and collaboration with the Mid Coast Council. And so that enabled us to kind of get in touch with the local people and try to identify specific areas that were heavily impacted by the fires and where we had a bit of an understanding or information that platypuses were kind of known to occupy the area in high numbers. And because obviously the area had quite a severe drought before, followed by the fires and a big flushing event that impacted water quality and caused a mass fish kill in the catchment. So we kind of focused in that area. When we finally managed to get our kind of act together and get a bit of funding to head out, it was about 6 months after the fires. So this was already in July 2020. As you can see here, there's the sequence of water levels and discharge on the Manning River. So 2019, the end of 2019 had a severe drought in the area. The Dingo Creek, specifically where we were focusing our research, experienced kind of a cease to flow. This was the first time in the local community's recollection that the creek actually stopped flowing. So the water levels were very low just before the fires and when the fires hit. And so we surveyed the area in about 6 months in July, 6 months after the fire. So it puts us somewhere here. Water levels had already restored. It was already after the big flushing event that occurred in the area. And so water levels were they weren't very high, but they were quite stable. And so we were focusing on Dingo Creek in the Manning River catchment. So we were surveying here, which was impacted. The headwaters were impacted by the fires, where quite extensive burning occurred. And so what we did was we were surveying areas in the upper reaches directly impacted by the fire, but we also wanted to survey some sites further downstream that were not directly impacted by the fire, but trying to gauge a bit of an assessment about the impact of potential decline in water quality after the flushing event of the fire. But also what we were also very interested to gauge was the capacity for deeper pools to sustain and support platypuses following the fire, the drought and the fire. And so those deep pools are found further downstream. So when we're discussing our findings, just keep in the back of your mind that these areas are shallower. So we use a different technique to survey platypuses. We use pike nets, and down here, there were really deep pools that we use a different approach. And as a kind of a bit of a control measure, again, we didn't have a before and after meets design. So as a control measure, we focused on the Thone River that was not impacted by the fires, but experienced also a severe drying period prior to the fires in the area. So in terms of even just perceptions about surveying in the area, here on the left, we've got Dingo Creek 6 months after the fire, and then on the right, the Thone. Visually, what was very obvious to us when we were starting to survey there was the understory. The trees themselves were recovering well. I think the mortality rates of the trees immediately next to the creek, along the creek, the riparian trees, did not exhibit any high mortality, and so they were quite recovering well. But there was significant differences in the understory, which was dominated by a lot of invasive species, compared to the Thone, where it was very lush and green and seemed quite pristine. Another difference that we noticed as we were setting nets and spending the nights there were frog calls, which it was kind of almost eerily quiet on the Dingo Creek compared to the Thone, so that was quite obvious as well. When we were surveying platypuses, Melody was chatting about there are different ways of surveying and reporting observations on platypuses, from simple observations, that is spending some time by the creek or river and trying to spot a platypus, to live trapping that requires a fair bit of effort, and platypuses are not easy to capture. All the work is done at night. And then that involves, when we catch platypuses, our approach is we catch a platypus, we anesthetize it for the duration for about half an hour. And during that half an hour, while the platypus is kind of sleeping, we are able to have a really close look. We tag it for mark recaptures, so that enables us to really do, over time, we can revisit an area and get a good understanding in terms of demographics, population size, and movement of individuals. We can take blood samples and biopsies for DNA analyses, and then we look at general health and food. So we can, here on the right, we can actually scrap some food items from the cheek pouch of platypuses and get an understanding of what it's eating. And we can take all different kinds of samples to get a good understanding about the condition of the platypus and its health. So in terms of our findings on Dingo Creek, in the upper reaches that were directly impacted by the fires, we were surveying 6 sites. One of them was mesh, the other 5 were pike nets. When I say sites, this is in a sense they're representing 4 sites. So in each site, we deployed 4 pairs of pike nets, covering about 500 meters to about a kilometer. So in a sense, a site can potentially refer to them as 4 sites. So we spend in these kind of 6 areas that were directly impacted by the fires, we caught very little platypuses. We only caught 1 platypus really up here in the upper reaches, and then another one further down using a mesh net. In comparison, in these deep pools that were not directly impacted by the fires, we caught 4 platypuses. And also, when we were chatting to the local landholders there that gave us access to the land, they mentioned seeing platypuses congregate in these deep pools during the dry periods. So there was quite, I guess, suggestive that these deep pools serve as kind of refugia during dry periods, and still supported a good number of platypuses following the fires. In comparison, on the Thone River, overall, our trapping success was much higher compared to Dingo Creek. 2 sites had pike nets, where we caught quite a few platypuses, and then in a deep pool further down, we caught 4 platypuses. And so in a sense, if we're comparing shallow pike net trapping success to deep mesh pool trapping success, there was quite a strong signal that platypuses were, or our trapping success of platypuses was greater on the unimpacted Thone River compared to the fire-impacted Dingo Creek. After the fires, we kind of, I guess, we came back with this feeling, okay, so the numbers are lower, but we don't really have a good understanding in terms of, so what happened to platypuses? Did they simply escape the fires, move down, and are just waiting for conditions to improve so they can make their way back up? Or whether platypuses actually expired in the fire. So that's still kind of a bit of a mystery for us. And so I was really curious to come back a year later and to do another survey and potentially see in terms of, what happened to the platypuses that we caught, whether they are moving further upstream. Are we catching new platypuses in these in these areas where we previously surveyed? And so to kind of get a better understanding about the capacity for platypuses to recover after fires. So we plan to go back in 2021, and we were aiming to do the surveys right after the breeding season, so we'd be able to capture and see recruitment of juveniles as well. And so that was the plan. And then the massive floods, this was like 2 weeks before our intended field trip, these massive floods swept through the area. But it was 2 weeks after the floods, and so we were kind of, okay, so let's go. Water levels are back to what, reasonable levels. We can survey now, and we're really curious to see how platypuses were faring now after the floods. So to our surprise, trapping success was very, very low. Water levels were reasonable. Like, we can set the nets. It wasn't, I don't think that was an issue. But we, in going back to exactly these same sites, putting exactly, the nets in those exact same spots, trapping success was very, very low. We only caught one platypus in the deep pool here on Dingo Creek and one platypus on the Thone, where we previously caught 4. So here we caught 4, now we caught 1, and likewise we caught 3 here, and now we caught only 1. In 3 mesh sites, we caught 3 platypuses here, so the average is 1 across 3 sites. So platypuses were still in this deep pool. We didn't catch any in this deep pool, and none up here. And in the Thone, we only caught 1 platypus where we caught 4 platypuses previously. The impact of the flood was very apparent on the Thone River more than on Dingo Creek. I know further downstream on Dingo Creek, there was quite a significant impact of the floods, but in terms of the scouring and the position of sediment and debris, I think it seems like that the area where we're serving on the Thone was more impacted and potentially posed a greater threat to platypuses. After the floods in the Winji Caribbee area, just as an anecdote in terms of, we don't have a really good understanding in terms of the impact of floods, but someone sent me a photo of a platypus that that was definitely swept by the floods and potentially died as a result of injuries during the floods. It's hard to tell, but when you get a platypus, hanging off a branch of a tree after floods, I think potentially that might suggest that floods can cause mortality of platypuses. That's our findings in terms of, there was an impact of, seemed to be an impact of fires on Dingo Creek. And then a year later, it seems like the floods have had some sort of impact on the platypuses again, whether they were swept further downstream or there was mortality. We don't know. I'm really keen to go back again in 2022 and do another survey and trying to really understand how these populations are responding to kind of extreme events, and hopefully the next few years we'll have better conditions and we'll see a recovery of the population in this specific area. One last slide. In terms of what we know about platypuses, observations in the area, what you have here is a summary of platypus observations at a 10 by 10 kilometer grid, colored by the last year of platypus observation. So green is a platypus being cited and reported to the Atlas of Living Australia in the past 10 years. Yellow hasn't been seen to between 10 and 20 years, and brown, further about 20 to 30 years, and red is no observation since 1990. There's reasonable good data along the Manning and Nondok rivers, as well as down here. But as you can see, in terms of our understanding about the kind of the landscape scale, understanding of where platypuses occur, there are quite significant knowledge gaps, with a lot of areas not having any platypus observations, as well as areas where platypuses haven't been reported in the last 10 years, so at least 10 years. So I think there's a lot of room to improve our understanding of where platypuses occur in the area. Thank you so much for you, WWF, Taronga Zoo, for helping us and giving us funding, and amazing community where we're serving that were supporting us. So thanks again.
Excellent. Thank you for everybody to participate in this workshop today. And firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land of the Mid-Coast region, and that's the Biripi people and the Warramai people. And I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I do, as Anissa mentioned, wish to acknowledge that this mostly is not my presentation or my knowledge to share. It's a presentation that's summarized from a detailed presentation by Andrew Steed of the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment. Andrew cannot join us to deliver this presentation, and I recognise Andrew's dedication and guidance and his expertise that he has brought to the management and conservation of the Manning River turtle. In terms of habitat and ecology, the general ecology of the species is emerging. The work of dedicated turtle researchers and field practitioners, some of which we have in participation in this workshop, over the last 5 years or so, has made major contributions to knowledge. There are some key elements here that we need to be mindful of, and that's the species preference for streams with clean cobblestones or rocky bottoms, the fact that the turtles are mostly in-stream in their nature and typically only emerging to nest or to bask, that nests are on silt or gravel banks near streams, and its dietary requirements. It's important to sort of keep those aspects of the ecology in mind in terms of adaptive management. Personally, the Manning River turtle is very special. It's firstly, it's endemic to the Manning River. It is found nowhere else in the world. And secondly, it has survived for tens of millions of years or more through continental geologic and climate upheaval and change. It existed at a time when Australia was finally detaching from the remainder of Gondwana land. So it's a relic. And yet here in our time, the species is at risk of extinction in the wild and facing a multitude of threats. So how do you conserve a threatened species like the Manning River turtle? In quite basic principles of conservation, you protect the sites that are important for the species survival. You do that actively and effectively, and important sites include refuges, nesting areas, high density and high aggregation sites. In an absence of understanding the genetic variability and fitness of the entire population, the active sites protection should focus on securing the population in sites across its range. Secondly, it needs the management of substantial threats, particularly to breeding adult survival and juvenile recruitment into the population. It requires the maintenance or enhancement of conditions that facilitate movement and dispersal, except where that movement might lead to a population sink situation, where those animals are lured into a death or stressful situation. And another one is the maintenance of an insurance population, and that's critical. And thanks to Aussie Ark and Ricky Spencer and their collaborators for their work in this space. And finally, there is a need to monitor, evaluate, and adapt. It's important to recognise that there has, in all of the survey work and the knowledge of the species, that only one nest of the Manning River turtle has been found to date. It's a key issue that relates to our knowledge and our adaptive conservation of the Manning River turtle, that only one nest has been found. Juvenile recruitment and survivability is a key issue for the species, and the need to significantly escalate research and knowledge of nesting locations, nesting success, nesting pressures is something that we will need to do collectively. moving forward. Here is a video of that nesting event. It's a grainy video. It was at dusk, I believe, in wet weather, but it shows the nesting event. Female turtle has excavated the nest site and is actively laying. So what are the threats? So the key threats, as we know them, are predation of basking adults, nesting females, and nests by pigs and foxes and potentially goannas. In dry times, turtles moving between pools would be very vulnerable to predation. Manning River turtles are short-necked and they cannot fully retract their heads into their defensive shell, so they have limited protection against the fox. The Macquarie turtle is a threat. It's been introduced to the Manning catchment. It is larger, so it is likely to outcompete with the Manning River turtle for resources, and can also interbreed with the Manning River turtle. The number and locations of Macquarie turtles has increased significantly over the last 8 years or so. There are many reported locations in the mid-Manning at Cundall Flat and Carrack Flat, Kimbrakai, Marlee, Number 1, Rocky Crossing, Bretai and Caffrey's Flat. Stock may trample nests where there is uncontrolled stock access to streams. Habitat loss and modifications of various types is a serious threat. The Manning River turtle is a beautiful animal. It is prized for collection, and illegal collection from the wild is a serious problem. There is significant risk of disease outbreak, such as the viral outbreak that nearly caused the extinction of the Bellinger River turtle. A virus has been identified in captive Manning River turtles in Queensland, and it is a cause of serious concern for this species. Importantly, there appears to be a link between possible disease, viral outbreaks, and higher temperatures. And that's really important when we're thinking about climate change and we're thinking about the integrity of stream banks and overhanging shading vegetation. As I mentioned, the rapidly human-induced changing climate suggests hotter and drier conditions, which is moving out of the apparent preference of this species. In terms of diving a bit deeper into key threats, there is a significant threat from predation, and we can assume this from the related species, the Bell's turtle, which has been investigated to a high degree in terms of fox predation. For Bell's turtle, there are reportedly very few young turtles in the populations, and fox predation of nests is estimated to be greater than 95%. Populations need greater reproductive success than this, or extinction in the wild is inevitable. Things might be a little different for the Manning River turtle. The nature of the landscapes and fox densities might be quite different from the Bell's turtle. So this is a significant area of research need. And here's a video that's provided by Louise Streeting of fox raiding 3 Bell's turtle nests, I believe in the same night. So you see the fox, it's a grainy video, but actively excavating the nest sites, removing the eggs, probably eating some, probably caching the rest, but results in the complete failure of each of those 3 nesting situations for the Bell's turtle in that context. In terms of the impacts from the drought, the 2019 drought was an observed mortality event for the Manning River turtle, as evidenced by the work of Andrew Steed, the National Parks and Wildlife Service, and Aussie Ark and their collaborators. The drought severely impacted the Barnard River. The National Parks and Wildlife Service organised for a team to go into the area to inspect the Manning River turtle habitat. And the condition of the riparian zone and stream was quite horrific, with long stretches of dry riverbed separating only very shallow muddy wallows, and the details of that salvage operation are there on the slide, but there was observed mortality from that event, and that event placed great pressure on the turtles of the Barnard River, which is considered a population stronghold or a habitat stronghold for Manning River turtles. The impacts of bushfires and floods. So it is also highly likely that direct or related or associated effects of the 2019 bushfires caused direct turtle mortality. Fires significantly impacted the turtles' range. 25% of the riparian areas were burnt, often severely. The fires killed fire-sensitive riparian vegetation that shades rivers and creeks and and contains the fruiting trees like figs and lily pillies that provide food for turtles. Caused a huge amount of leaf fall, allowed exposed soils and ash to be swept into streams, altering stream bed conditions and impacting water quality. In positive news, some turtles have been surveyed and detected in fire-affected landscapes in post-fire monitoring. Remarkably similarly to the platypus, the Manning River turtle shows a high degree of preference to streams that have cobblestone or rocky bottoms, and are negatively correlated with situations of heavy silt layers on stream beds. And the post-fire floods that happened were observed to cause significant and heavy silt deposition on stream beds in known turtle survey areas. And this was a particular issue. Surveys in March of 2020 in the relatively undisturbed Rollies River, where 16 Manning River turtles were caught in March 2019, found no turtles. The river bottom was thick with a fine silt that clouded the water when snorkeling. And at the same time, along the Barnard River, surveys only found Manning River turtles resting in a small area where cobblestones were exposed, and no turtles were observed where the stream bed was of heavy silt deposits. So where are the Manning River turtles? There's been significant investment in surveys of the Manning River turtle by the Saving Our Species program and Regan and Rye of Hunter Local Land Services since 2017 using netting and snorkeling techniques. And I wish to thank and acknowledge the three expert turtle researchers and ecologists that have undertaken these surveys, Darren Fielder, Phil Spark and Bruce Chessman. There's been incredible support from landholders across the Manning catchment, and this is testament to the advocacy and engagement work of Andrew Steed and others. Over 115 individual landholders have allowed access to their properties for survey work, which has given researchers access to about 500 kilometres of river front, which is about 35% of the overall potential habitat of the Manning River turtle. Absolutely outstanding level of community engagement and landholder support for the work. Up until 2020, nearly 400 Manning River turtles had been caught. Only 16 marked turtles had been recaught, and all but one had been recaught in the same place that it was originally captured. One turtle had moved about 3.5 kilometres upstream. And surveys have been done at over 140 sites, with turtle records at about 60% of those sites. Okay, so this graph shows the number of Manning River turtles caught by their size and their gender. The yellow is the females, the green is the males, and the grey is where the sex of the individual is not determined. Encouragingly, there is a good sex ratio of females to males and a range of sizes, including juveniles. And this proportion of females and the range of sizes may suggest that predation is not decimating some populations like it does for Bell's turtle, and that breeding is reasonably successful, at least in some areas. So we all like some positive news and some hope. So what is being done? And this is a conversation for tomorrow at length in our workshop sessions, but there is a lot being done. So a working group has been formed, and this comprises Department of Planning, Industry and Environment, Hunter Local Land Services, the Manning River Turtle Group, MidCoast to Tops Landcare and Manning Landcare, MidCoast Council, Aussie Ark, Turtle Ecologists, and the Tari Indigenous Development and Employment Group, along with a range of other collaborators, universities, and landholders. It is a passionate and motivated group, and its combined value is worth far more collectively than the sum of each of its individual parts. And I certainly feel privileged to be part of that working group. There is a range of continuing field surveys to increase species knowledge. There is discussion around the possibility and the potential for eDNA surveys to contribute to our body of knowledge. There is a range of on-ground actions and research being undertaken, some of which are grant funded. There are insurance populations, and again, I'd recognise Aussie Ark and Ricky Spencer in that space. There's aquatic refugia projects. Significantly, there are art, community and schools engagement, water watch programs, and things like health analyses for disease. There is a collective body of work being undertaken at the present time. In the space of engagement, I would certainly wish to recognise in this forum the work of the volunteer Manning River Turtle Group in bringing community awareness to the plight of the turtle, advocating passionately for its protection and encouraging landholder participation in surveys. There are intrinsic reasons behind us conserving the Manning River turtle. There are ancient lineages and Gondwanan legacies, and these are powerful and compelling. But also, if we conserve the Manning River turtle, we help conserve many other species too. We preserve the integrity and condition and function of iconic streams and rivers that we as residents and visitors to the Manning appreciate culturally, aesthetically, and recreationally. I am empowered to play my part in the species conservation, and I appreciate and value your participation in our workshop. And that is it for me. Thank you.
Yeah, so I just caveat, Matt had a very comprehensive presentation, so a lot of my stuff will be a bit of repetitive stuff, I'm afraid, but there will be some other insights hopefully along the way. It's very brief, and I'm focused in on the threatening processes and what we can do from a research community as well as management actions at the end. So forgive me for some of the issues being repeated, but maybe that's not too bad anyway. So I've just listed off a few threatening processes that I was just going to present in a brief slide presentation with some comments at the end. So as Matt has been discussing, we do have habitat modification. We do have some riparian vegetation issues and nesting predation on the turtle population, along with disease and eye lesions potentially impacting on the population, and hybridization with the Amadura, as we just spoke about, and the climate change issues of drought and fire. So I just wanted to present to you some more about the habitat modification as well. So there are a number of other landscape issues that we would all be familiar with that impact on our riparian and in-stream environments, such as weed infestation. So for the Manning River catchment, there are a number of weeds that have taken hold in some areas, which are impacting on the habitat for the Manning River turtle in terms of nesting opportunity and bank and streamside vegetation, such as small leaf privet, camphor laurels, lantana. There's a number of weeds that we could go on. There's many of them, but in particular, small leaf privet is taking over in some of the catchments, such as Bourbon Creek and Dingo Creek, and a number of other spots. When you go further west, it's sort of more about lantana and wild tobacco and a number of other, such as blackberry. So these catchment related issues do have some impact on the Manning River turtle. What that impact is sort of unquantified at this stage, but is certain to have some effect on them. The other part of it is when you get into the more developed agricultural landscapes, there's a reverse situation where there's a lack of riparian vegetation, which is starting to change the geomorphology of the rivers so that they become shallower, wider streams, and you're starting to get increased silt and sedimentation within those pools that are there. So what you're getting is a shallowing of your deeper pools, which are critical, as we were discussing before, for drought refugia. So when you're getting major landscape change across the catchment, it ultimately ends up over time changing how the streams function through the Manning River. How that relates to the Manning River turtle is still a little bit unquantified, but it appears to result in shallower pools, more aquatic macrophyte growth and algal growth, and you can also get eutrophication of the streams with excessive nutrients from the cattle grazing. So these effects are there, they're present, but how they relate directly to the turtle is yet to be fully analysed. The other part of the loss of native riparian vegetation by shading out of weeds and other species, or just the clearing of the vegetation, is that the Manning River turtle, from our observation of in stream when we go catching the Manning River turtle, in the rainforested and more shaded streams in the upper catchments, for example, Bourbon Creek or Dingo Creek, or any of those ones that are the Gloucester, or any of those that are highly rainforest and closed canopy situations, the syzygiums and other fruiting shrubs and trees provide a very important food source for the Manning River turtle. So the top left photo there is an example of the defecated fruits from turtles that were kept in a tub of water for several hours while we were waiting to process them. And so as you can see there, they're evidence of the syzygium being eaten in large quantities by the turtles when they're fruiting. As we were going through snorkeling and catching the turtles, you could see these fruits just on the bottom of the bedrock and cobble stream. And so these fruits were quite abundant during the times when they are fruiting, obviously. So my assessment is that at seasonal times, these fruiting bodies can be an important part of the diet for the Manning River turtle. So that has implications for what might be done to enhance or restore areas for the turtle. I won't go into too much of this. We're all pretty familiar with nest predation and the fact that foxes are just a superior predator for finding eggs. And as you can see there from Lou Streeting's work in the Bell's Turtle Project, there's many different options that we can do to try and help protect the nests. But for the Manning River turtle, it's still a bit of an unknown as to how much is actually happening in terms of fox predation on nests. We haven't done the studies to work out how much is happening of that. The other interesting one that's becoming more apparent for the Bell's turtle is the evidence of disease and eye lesions in the turtle population. So some recent study done by a number of people in the Bell's turtle program at Armidale with Martin Dillon and the team there have indicated that up to 30% or more of adult populations of turtles can have these eye lesions. And it's just an interesting part of it. Whether this is a long-term concern for the health of the turtles is a bit uncertain. However, I've personally caught 2 female turtles of the Manning River turtle with eye lesions. So that's a low number compared to what we have been capturing, but it is present, obviously. So we just need to be aware of that and take that in consideration down the track in terms of biosecurity and controls. With the hybridization that was just mentioned briefly there, so with the Amidura macquarieii, one of the key concerns from the Manning River turtle point of view is that we have a relatively low number, but is getting bigger by the year in terms of the number of Amiduras that are present in the system. So what we are seeing is these adult males having excursions by some 15, 20 kilometers upstream from other known populations of Amidura, and they've been traveling vast distances upstream in search of mates, or just as male turtles tend to be the ones that will move vast distances, that this is happening at the moment. So we do capture every so often an individual male Amidura quite a distance upstream to where we thought they were present. So it's an indication of how rapidly the movement of these turtles can be undertaken, I guess, across the catchment. So as with the Ballinger River turtle, there is the opportunity now that there is some hybrids out there in the population. Again, we don't know that for sure because genetics would tell us more about that. However, we haven't undertaken those genetic studies at the moment. I won't dwell on this too much either because Matt did a good job on the drought and fire conditions that may be playing a part in the conservation for the Manning River turtle. So the Bernard River in particular was a very hard hit catchment of the Manning River catchment. So these are photos from Phil Spark and his work that he did a season or 2 ago. And that was evidence of just an amazing climatic event that basically left only a handful of permanent pools in the whole of the Bernard River. So the photo on the right there is one of those small pools that was left. As you can see by the rock on the other side, you can see where there is the permanent water level mark with the white rock and the darker rock. So this is some, 1.5 meters below where it would normally be flowing. So it would be fairly catastrophic if a whole catchment or a distributary like the Bernard were to go dry in those upper catchments over a season. There would be fairly limited opportunity for those Manning River turtles to survive that event in situ. They would either have to relocate or potentially be stranded and left to die there. So I believe that from Phil's data that they were still there. So it's more likely that should these pools go completely dry, you would lose a certain segment of the population. So I guess where does that leave us with some of the research that we've been doing to date? There's still many questions yet to be fully investigated. So we don't know a lot about the Manning River turtle. We have some assumptions. We have some comparisons to sister species of the bells or the Ballinger River turtle, so we can start to infer how they may be reacting to these threats. However, there's still more work to be done in terms of a purely scientific research point of view. So some of the key areas that need to be looked at a bit more is the dietary requirements. As we were just talking about, there are seasonal elements to their diet. So whether that's switching from fruiting bodies through to algal or macrophytic growth, or macroinvertebrates in those cobble streams as well. So we're not completely on top of that. There's been some studies been done, but still a few gaps in knowledge there. Baseline surveys of population on numbers, so we're getting there, but we still have more data requirements there. We've surveyed quite a few spots, but in total numbers, we haven't got to sort of scratch the surface much there. The reproductive biology of the Manning River turtle is an interesting one. From where do they have their nesting preferences? How much of the nests are being predated on? And that aspect of it is a little bit unknown at the moment. So as Matt said before, there's only been one active nest located in the catchment. So we're still in the dark on how and where Manning River turtles are nesting and breeding. Survivorship rates of immature and mature turtles. As we build up on our baseline survey requirements, we'll become more familiar with their survivorship rates. Like most other turtles, they would be living for many years. However, the recruitment into the population and how many of those survive through to maturity is still unknown. And I also mentioned a little bit about genetic studies on the hybridization of Amidura. So at the moment, we haven't really got that understanding from a genetic point of view as to have we got hybrids in the system? Where is the Amidura that's in the system now? Where have they come from? Which other catchments potentially have they come from? Or is there a mix of Amidura populations from different river systems in there? And we also have a fairly limited understanding of their habitat requirements and modification, although that's becoming clearer as we become more familiar with their habitat areas that they're in. So that's the conservation research elements that could be key areas to fill gaps in knowledge. And from a management action point of view, I've just briefly listed off some of them. Matt did a good job with some of the other areas of focus as well. And so based on knowledge of other turtle recovery programs, protecting nest banks and sandbars and locations across key strategic areas could be a good way to go in terms of recruitment back into the system. If we feel that there is a lack of recruitment in some catchments, making sure that we actually protect those areas of nesting banks. Also, as we come across nests, is actually protecting those nests from fox predation as soon as possible. There's a number of people on this forum here that know a lot more about fox predation and nest protection than I do, but that's part of the program of works. Then there's the control of feral animals, primarily foxes. So is there, sometimes it's a bit of a lost cause. You control 10 foxes and, 20 more come in the next night. But there's other ways to control them. Maybe it's cordoning off areas from foxes getting into there. So it might not be actually taking the foxes out, but it's preventing their movement in certain areas. Weed control and riparian zone enhancements. So how do we go about doing that in key areas that we feel require that? So that's some landowner management actions that can be done in situ. We also may need to think about how we deal with the next major drought situation. Do we have a rapid response team that goes out and collects a few of those drying pools and making sure that we recover some of those key populations of turtles as the waterholes are drying? There's also the water resource management side of things and making sure that we don't actually pump the water out during key drought periods to actually, piggyback on a drought where we're making it worse by sucking the water out too quickly. So it's all about protecting those permanent refugia areas. So identifying them, mapping them, and knowing where those deeper permanent water holes are and protecting them. Removal of Amidura individuals across the catchment. So we've had different forums talk about this side of things. And so just to reiterate, there's a number of ways that we can look at Amiduras. If they are truly a problem with hybridization, we may need to be looking at removing these individuals that are doing forays up into the upper catchment, so the single individual male. Perhaps there's an opportunity to draw a line on the catchment where any Amidura found upstream of a certain point is taken out of the system. It could also be the whole lot. It could be, there is a small enough population, if it was to be acted on now, every time that someone goes in and pulls out an Amadura, it doesn't get released back into the stream. Insurance populations and head starting, we've talked a bit about that. Ocearca obviously doing an excellent job in that area. And the head starting side of things is a key strategy for some threatened turtles across New South Wales. So that's a well advanced strategy. So that hasn't happened necessarily just yet for the Manning River turtle, but as the insurance populations get bigger and bigger, there's that capacity to then release those head-started hatchlings. Strategic grazing management, and so that's for nesting and erosion control sites. It wouldn't be across the whole catchment. It's just in key locations where you feel that the Manning River turtle needs a little bit of a hand to restore some of the riparian areas. That's obviously a total grazing sort of management issue with the agricultural enterprises and so forth. So it's that interaction with landholders. And then lastly, I just wanted to raise the issue of biosecurity measures for the virus control. As we are mostly aware, the Ballinger River turtle, nearly got wiped out within 6 weeks by a virus. So we definitely don't want that virus moving cross catchments. And we certainly have to be careful about how turtles get moved around in the catchment, and also when they go into a captive population, and having checks and controls there to ensure that viruses don't enter into those insurance populations and vice versa back from the insurance population into the wild population. So there'll be quite a few measures that we can instigate around biosecurity. That's pretty much the end of my conversation there. Apologise that it was a bit of a duplicate of some of Matt's information, but hopefully there's some different angles on that. So thank you for that.